you are convinced that there is some malign entity in the room kind of about to get you and do horrible things to you.
This October, IFLScience are diving into the science behind the supernatural. I'm science writer Dr. Russell Moore, and I'm joined today by anomalistic psychologist Professor Chris French to discuss the science behind the strange. From paranormal activity to sleep paralysis, mediums, the power of suggestion, and the terror of Celine Dion. Come with us on this scientifically accurate journey to the other side. Professor Chris French, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So today we're talking about the psychology and the science of hauntings, the supernatural, the paranormal, mostly in preparation for IFLScience's big event in the coming weeks, where we are going to be visiting Chillingham Castle in Northumbria, what is meant to be Britain's most haunted castle. And
one of many most haunted castles.
One of many, so we found. And, you know, we brave few are planning to be spending an evening there. And so we thought we'd speak to an expert and try and just get a sense of what we're likely to experience, what our minds are likely to do with us in the dark. So I thought, you know, best to speak to a professor of anomalistic psychology.
Fair enough, yeah.
I suppose the first question then, given how easy that was for me to say, is what is anomalistic psychology?
Anomalistic psychology, people used to ask me kind of what was my research area, and I would come out with quite a mouthful. It's the psychology of ostensibly paranormal experiences and related beliefs, and that was a bit too much, really. So I wanted a nice, concise term. I didn't invent the term anomalistic psychology. It was already about. I thought, that's it, that's the one for me. So now when people ask me, I can just say anomalistic psychology, and their immediate response is always, what the hell is that? And so it's the psychology of ostensibly paranormal experiences and related beliefs. Didn't really do the job, but there you go. I think more people are aware of this thing called anomalistic psychology now, but it is essentially, as is the title of my recent book, it's the science of weird shit that we're talking here.
People might be familiar with the idea of parapsychologists. Does an anomalistic psychologist differ from a...
It's a very, very good question, and something which I cover in my recent book. But the relationship between anomalistic psychology and parapsychology, it's more a matter of emphasis than anything else, to be perfectly honest. Most of the focus of the research that we did at the Anomalistic Psychology Research Unit was coming from a kind of skeptical perspective, starting from a working hypothesis of, let's just assume that paranormal forces don't exist. Can we explain the kind of weird experiences that people have that they report in psychological terms? And can we put our own explanations, wherever possible, to the test? See if we can produce evidence for them. Having said that, for me, an important part of being a skeptic is to always be open to the possibility that you might be wrong. New evidence might come along that makes you change your mind. So there was a kind of lesser strand of our research where we would directly test paranormal claims. Parapsychologists typically focus more on just trying to see if they can produce evidence to support the existence of things like telepathy, psychokinesis, and so on. But most of them are well aware of the kind of skeptical side of things as well, and sometimes they'll dip a toe in the water and do research that I would describe as anomalistic psychology. So one of the big influences on me was the late Professor Bob Morris, and he embraced both approaches. You know, he was very aware of the skeptics' arguments, and he would sometimes put those to the test through either directly or through his postgraduates.
Okay, so it's kind of two sides of the same thing, exactly. Working the way into the middle.
And it's almost kind of, as an anomalistic psychologist, I've pretty much got the word skeptic tattooed across my forehead to indicate what my perspective is on things. But I have a lot of respect for people who would label themselves as parapsychologists. I say, you know, get on with it. If you can produce really, really strong evidence, that'd be amazing.
No, of course, because you're still aiming for the same kind of outcomes, explaining phenomena that people are experiencing.
Yeah.
So with that in mind then, what would you say are the kind of common psychological factors that might make somebody believe they're having a paranormal experience?
Again, I used to do a kind of 22-hour lecture course on this, so trying to boil it down. Particularly when it comes to ghosts, I would say that the two most important psychological factors are, first of all, context. So I think many people will have had the experience maybe of being shown around an old stately home, and if someone says, and this bedroom is supposed to be haunted, it completely changes your mental set when you go in there. You hear creaks and noises that you wouldn't normally pay any attention to, any kind of draft, cold draft, or anything like that. You notice. You probably wouldn't have even noticed that stuff if somebody hadn't primed you for it, but it does change you. You become a bit more on edge, a bit more anxious. So context is important, and again, there's good empirical evidence from experimental studies that show that really does have an effect. And secondly, prior belief. Do you already believe in ghosts? Because if you do, again, and there's good evidence for this, you are more likely to have some kind of ghostly experience while you're walking around a reputedly haunted location than somebody who's a total skeptic. So those two factors I think are really, really important. But then there's all kinds of other factors that can come into play as well. One common reason for people developing a belief that maybe their house is haunted is if they were, for example, suffering from episodes of sleep paralysis and had not been made aware of the fact that there is a scientific and medical literature on sleep paralysis. It's a fairly common experience, but it can be absolutely terrifying. And I would say it's a hallucinatory experience. Yes. And in broad terms, we do understand the kind of psychophysiology of what's going on. But as I say, if you're somebody who's never heard of these explanations and it's happening to you, you're likely to either think, well, either something weird and supernatural really is happening, or I'm going crazy. And out of those two, you probably prefer the idea that something real is happening.
And the idea of sleep paralysis, that's something that society is becoming more kind of aware of, probably in the last 20 or so years with the rise of the internet.
Well, I hope society is becoming more aware of it, but there's still an awful lot of ignorance, even in places where you wouldn't expect it. As in kind of medical professionals and so on. I talk about a case in the book of an old lady who got in touch with me, and very kind of late in life, she'd lived in an old house out in the middle of nowhere, and she began to think her house was haunted. She was having these weird experiences, and then amazingly she managed to, on the internet, pick up information about sleep paralysis. She realised that's what the explanation was. But having made that realisation, she then went to see her GP to ask if there was any advice about what she could do to cope with it. And he just kind of dismissed her, kind of with an arrogant, I've never heard of it. Right. 30 seconds on Google and you'll realise there's a big literature out there on it. And that really, really annoyed me, because people often don't talk about these experiences because they worry, with some justification, that people will kind of look at them as and think you're a bit weird, you're a bit crazy, aren't you? And they're not. There's this thing called sleep paralysis. I want to get that message out there, essentially, for anybody that's not heard of it amongst the listeners, in its most basic form, it's something that happens between sleep and wakefulness, and it is, just as it says on the can, it's a temporary period of paralysis. And typically, it lasts a few seconds and you snap out of it. But for a smaller percentage of people, it can be associated with these other symptoms that can make it absolutely terrifying. And that includes things like, sometimes it's just a very, very strong sense of presence. You are convinced that there is some malign entity in the room kind of about to get you and do horrible things to you. But you may actually also kind of get hallucinations in any sensory modality. You may hear voices or footsteps, or you may see demons or lights moving around. It can be anything that your imagination can dream up. You get tactile hallucinations, and bear in mind, you can open your eyes. Surprisingly, one of the few parts of your body that you can move is your eyes, so you can see you're in your bedroom. It does not feel like a dream. What it actually is, it's a kind of combination of normal waking consciousness and REM consciousness, rapid eye movement consciousness, which is the phase of sleep which is associated with vivid dreams. So all that weird imagery is coming through into normal consciousness. And I get sent lots of first-hand accounts, and even though these are people who know that it's a hallucination, it's absolutely terrifying because it feels so real while it's happening.
I mean, I've never personally experienced it. I have a number of friends who have, and some of their explanations have been chilling.
Absolutely,
have you ever experienced it personally?
I've had I've had the milder versions of it, not the kind of full whistles and bells version.
No.
But you can see why somebody, if you already believe in ghosts, and it's a perfectly rational explanation. It gives you a total explanation for what you think you've been through, and again, it doesn't account for all ghostly encounters, but it does account for an awful lot. So many of these encounters take place when people are actually in bed, in the dark. And
that feeling of being persecuted.
Yeah.
I recently was reading up on a kind of anthropology of sleep paralysis and how different cultures have different beliefs of the entity that's assailing them. So if you're in Eastern European context, you might believe you're about to be attacked by some sort of vampire-like being that's going to suck your life from you. In Europe or Western Europe and the UK, we historically had the idea of the witch, where we get the idea
witches,
of hag-ridden from.
And then in the Middle Ages in Europe, it was sex-crazed demons,
the incubus
and the succubus who'd come and have their wicked way with you while you were asleep. I mean, again, there's well over 100 different words to describe the experience from different countries and from different eras, and usually it's interpreted in supernatural terms. And some of them are kind of so creepy. I mean, one of my favourites is St. Lucia. They call it Cockmar, and it's the spirits of unbaptized children that crawl onto your chest and throttle you. So do sleep well tonight, won't you?
I mean, there we are. That's going to stick in a few minds.
Yeah, I think so.
But so while you were describing that, I mean, you were saying that these are experiences that people are having, and they don't necessarily have an explanation for it, and so they want to not feel that they're insane. So they're looking for an explanation that might, satisfy that this is an external force coming in. But we have a society that is increasingly, or supposed to be increasingly, scientifically literate, evidence-based, you might say. But these ideas still exist. So what do you think is kind of enabling these ideas to persist in people and the belief?
I think you can make a pretty plausible case in terms of evolutionary psychology. In terms of our evolution, our brains have evolved to keep us alive long enough to pass our genes on to the next generation. Full stop.
Yes.
That's it. Not to apprehend the truth with a capital T about the nature of the universe, And in those terms, for most of our evolutionary history, there were real threats out there from predators, from enemies, and so on and so forth. And so we have basically our brains are kind of pre-wired to be constantly on the lookout for potential threats. And there's good evidence to show that, amongst the many cognitive biases that we suffer from, there is a bias towards believing that when something happens in the world around us, it happens because someone or something with intentions towards us made it happen. And again, in terms of our survival, that's quite a good bias to have, because very often, certainly in terms of our evolutionary history, there may have been a real threat out there. And the cost of running away from a threat that isn't really there is a lot less than the cost of missing a threat that is really there. Sure. So our brains have developed with a bias towards these kind of type 1 errors rather than the type 2 errors. And our brains are the same. Our brains haven't changed that much in many, many millennia. And so it's not a big leap from there to kind of, it can generalize beyond just kind of hearing a noise in the night and, wondering whether it might be a burglar or a ghost or whatever else it may be, to things like, the crops failing in the fields. Well, that happened because someone or something made it happen. Maybe we've angered the gods, blah, 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 blah. Maybe it was a witch, so on and so forth. So I think a lot of the kind of biases that underlie our propensity towards paranormal beliefs can be explained in terms of those cognitive biases. Another factor here is that we're successful as a species to the extent that we are because we're very good at seeing meaning and significance in what's going on in the world around us. but sometimes we overplay that, and we think we see meaning and significance when it isn't really there.
Sure.
And again, that's another factor that can play into this.
And I suppose there's also cultural factors as well. IFLScience, I've written a few articles kind of challenging some misbeliefs and debunking a few stories out there. And I did one recently on urban legends. And one of the responses I had back was, but it's all fun.
I think that is a big part of it. But I mean, the kind of whole world of the paranormal, if you like. There's not a single explanation. I mean, a lot of people read their horoscopes, but the surveys suggest that only 25% actually take it seriously, but 75% actually read them. I mean, if I'm really bored on a train and there's an old metro line there, I might pick it up and have a look. And people who watch programs like Most Haunted and that kind of stuff, some of them really do take it very seriously and think it's all real. But a lot of them are watching it purely for entertainment value, and so it is important to kind of try and assess to the degree to which people really believe in this stuff, as opposed to just having an interest and a fascination with it. I mean, it's quite interesting. I remember going to a conference a few years back, and there was a panel of 4 horror writers, Reece Shearsmith and Stephen Volk, really kind of quite big names. Every single one of them was a skeptic. they just love the genre,
Just like the genre, yeah.
They just love the genre.
I
I'm
can
listening
appreciate
to kind of M.R. James at the moment on Audible,
Yeah, no,
and they're
exactly.
wonderful stories.
Yeah, we enjoy that storytelling capacity.
Yeah.
I suppose it also slightly enchants the world again.
Well, yeah, there's that, and I mean, my own kind of, we're kind of widening it out a lot here, but my own kind of attitude, being a kind of card-carrying humanist, I personally don't believe in supernatural stuff at all. But I've no objection to other people believing that stuff if it's a positive thing in their lives. I mean, if you want my opinion kind of as a scientist, how do I think the evidence lines up? Well, I'll tell you, But if somebody takes great comfort from their belief in life after death, why would I want to take that away from them? That's fair enough. As long as you're not imposing your belief system on other people or anything like that, then fine, believe whatever you like.
Sure, and I suppose the flip side of it is also individuals are trying to take advantage of that and benefit from that, the kind of grief harvesting, as it were, for want of a better phrase.
But again, on that front, you see, I mean, I make a huge distinction, as I presume you would too, between mediums and psychics who sincerely believe that they have a gift, and those, and in my personal opinion, I might be wrong about this, but in my personal opinion, it's only a minority who are deliberate con artists. There are techniques that you can use that can be extremely effective. I mean, I once passed myself off as a psychic I was a medium, in fact, on Richard and Judy.
Really?
Yeah. I've been there, done that, because there's a technique called cold reading, which, I mean, like anything else, the more you practice it, the better you get. I wasn't particularly good, but I could still get away with it well enough for that. But I think the vast majority of people who claim to have a gift, they really do believe that they have. And I don't put those people in the same category at all as those who are deliberately exploiting, people who are anxious or vulnerable, and certainly those who are kind of making money from it. I don't have a lot of respect for them.
Yes, yes, but it's a difficult line to kind of walk, isn't it? When you're trying to challenge a kind of a broad church, educate or show how our minds can work, which you do excellent in your book, by the way.
Thank you.
And I would plug this for the readership. It's a fantastically written and very accessible explanation for why people believe in what we believe. But then at the same time, you might be also trying to challenge those minority of individuals who are trying to take advantage.
Oh, definitely.
And purport, misinformation or just get money for things. So it is difficult to kind of walk that line and live and let live. What role do you think media plays in this? Do you think social media and media more generally play a positive role, or do they add kind of distortions and misinformation that winds things up?
It's both. It's inevitably it's both. I mean, the media have always had a kind of an important role insofar as if you look at the kind of levels of belief just as revealed by public opinion polls, surveys and so on, you will find that there's always a very big, sizable minority usually who believe in each different kind of paranormal phenomenon. Overall, probably over half the population will endorse at least one of those things. So this is a part of the human condition. These beliefs are very, very common. A sizable but smaller proportion of those people will say they've personally experienced these things. So there is something there that we need to explain. But in terms of the media's role, you'll find that it can kind of make those percentages fluctuate up. So for example, when the X-Files was at the height of its popularity, I think that did have a kind of noticeable effect. When Close Encounters of the Third Kind came out, again you saw a rise in belief in UFOs and so on. And so, I mean, the media love this stuff, which is, this is why we're chatting today.
Here we are.
It is stuff that people do find fascinating. It's the sort of stuff that people talk about down at the pub or if they're, out for dinner and so on. And whether you're a believer or a skeptic, most people do find this stuff interesting, which is why it's a really fun area to kind of have specialised in. But the media can have both a positive and a negative role. And when it comes to social media in particular, the internet is kind of a wonderful source of information, but it's also a wonderful source of misinformation and disinformation. And so, what skeptics, people talk about that, use the phrase skeptical movement. I don't really like that term, but it's a useful shorthand. We've known about fake news for years. It's not a new phenomenon, since the kind of mid-70s, there's been kind of organised groups trying to kind of challenge a lot of the misinformation, the misconceptions that people believe in. It's always been there. It's never been quite so much part of the mainstream as it is these days, thanks to a certain American president, amongst other factors. I think we just have to try and do our best and just try to encourage critical thinking, which is not to try to tell people what to believe, more how to assess the evidence and come to a kind of what hopefully is the best conclusion on the basis of the evidence as it currently stands.
Yes, I suppose part of the issue. So when I used to do a lot of teaching at university level, with undergrads, was engaging with critical skills, and there was a kind of assumption that critical meant, in the kind of common sense of that when we use to criticize something, you're being negative. Yeah. So there was the idea that critical thinking was then some sort of adjunct to that. Yeah. Whereas actually, it's, as you say, just having the ability to weigh up information and engage with it in a way that doesn't just take it on face value. I suppose there is a question there about kind of societal literacy. We talk about scientific literacy in the community as well, and to what extent that is something that needs greater fostering in our education system.
No, you're quite right. The word skeptic has very negative connotations for lots of people. Now, for me, a skeptic is just somebody who says, show me the evidence.
Sure.
There's a lot of really weird things that turn out to be true, but it's about kind of show me the evidence, convince me. I'm open to the possibility that you might be right, but I'm not convinced so far, so show me some more evidence. It's not just about automatically dismissing claims without looking at the evidence. And I think a lot of people think that it is, when you get onto the whole topic of, skeptics are often accused of not being open-minded, or close-minded. Yes. I have put more hours and more time into directly testing paranormal claims than pretty much all of the people who might direct that criticism my way, and I just haven't produced any evidence that convinces me that the paranormal is real. Whereas there's nothing. The question is always, what's the evidence that could convince you that you're wrong?
Yes.
And I can usually say what the evidence is that would convince me that I'm wrong, and I've actually put it to the test many, many times, and no doubt will do so again. Whereas these people, no, they know they're right, and there's nothing that could ever convince them that they're wrong. So I wouldn't say, I'd say my attitude is a bit more open-minded than theirs.
You have a mechanism for change. Yes, exactly. We're going to be in Chillingham next week, and I think I said to you when we weren't filming that there's some conditions I can imagine that would change a few minds that could easily occur if the stories are correct.
I shall look forward to hearing back.
Yeah, exactly. It might be just an audio tape found, discarded with plenty of screams and nothing more. Never seen again in the crew. Though with that in mind, so we're going to be at Chillingham. One of the experiments we're going to be running, we intend to take part in. I would like to take part in a kind of a classic 19th century séance, but we don't have maracas and instruments that we can throw around in the dark. So we're going to settle on a Ouija board and a planchette. And I know you can do a kind of budget version of this, just with an upturned glass on a flat surface, and arrange letters to spell out your information. But we've invested in the spooky board that we're intending to play with. Now, a person who believes in the supernatural will say that if that moves, it will spell out information because of the influence of an entity on the other side guiding our movements. What does science say about this when we get down to
science would say this is caused by something called the ideomotor effect. In short, people are pushing the planchette, but they're not consciously aware of the fact that they're doing that. And this is something that has been kind of studied quite extensively. It's the same explanation that applies to dowsing. In fact, one of my favourite examples of an investigation of this sort was going back to the time of Michael Faraday. And why I really like it is that Faraday's attitude when he heard there was a craze of what was called table tilting back in the Victorian era, and the idea there was you'd take a small round wooden table, the sitters would put their hands on the table and they'd attempt to communicate with the spirits by asking questions, and on a successful session then allegedly that the table would move of its own accord. There'd be jolts and jerks, and sometimes on a really good session it might end up with them having to chase the table around the room trying to keep their hands in contact with it. Now Faraday heard about this and he was intrigued, and rather than, just like most scientists certainly of that day and of this, just rejecting this, saying that's nonsense, that I'm not paying any attention to that, he wanted to get to the bottom of it, so he actually did some experiments. He got people in who were doing this table tilting. I'll just give you one example. He came up with a series of kind of quite ingenious experiments. But for example, rather than getting people to put their hands directly on the table surface, he had layers of waxed paper, and they put their hands on top of the waxed paper, which was then obviously on top of the table surface. Now, if you think about it, if the table moves to the right, if it's an external force that's causing that, perhaps a spirit, then people's hands will drag behind it a little bit and the wax sheets will be spread to the left. If, on the other hand, they are moving the table themselves, even though they're not aware of it, then the table will drag behind their hands and the wax sheets will be spread out to the right. And you can guess what he found.
Sure.
Yeah. But I really like the fact that he was open to testing it and to explaining it rather than just dismissing it.
No, yeah, so he engaged with that. And I've spoken to individuals who have been involved in table tipping, and they've explained that, from their experience, not only did the table tip or move, it levitated, and they've given me various estimations on how much that levitation has occurred, and I've been challenged with that perspective of, explain this. How did that table rise? And my usual response is I wasn't there, so it's difficult for me to be able to comment on that. But to what extent do you think memory plays a role as well? I only have their recap.
Well, exactly. There's a couple of comments there. One is, of course, that as you say, you need to know the exact conditions, who was present, and so on and so forth. We do know that certainly during the height of the popularity of séances, that it was a rare medium indeed who wasn't caught red-handed cheating. Now there are various ways that you can make a table appear to rise and levitate, and certainly under the conditions of typical conditions of a séance with very dim, if any, illumination. The sitters were not allowed to move; they had to stay, rigidly still. It was claimed that if they attempted to kind of interfere in any way, this would kill the medium. There's no recorded instances of this actually happening, but So first of all, there's lots of cheating. So it might be that you've got somebody giving you an accurate memory that the table really did rise. Yeah. But on the other hand, we also know that memory is very susceptible to the power of suggestion. And perception as well is also. So, interestingly, the very first systematic study of the unreliability of eyewitness testimony was carried out in the context of a faked séance. There was a guy called S.J. Davy who went along to various séances and initially was convinced that this was all supernatural, the stuff that he was seeing, but then caught on to the fact that no, it was all done by trickery, practiced the trickery himself, and then laid on his own séance. And he got his sitters to write down as accurately and in as much detail as they could what they had just witnessed. And the point being that the accounts they gave were just so far off from what had actually happened. They remembered things in the wrong order, they misremembered who was present, what objects had been touched, and so on and so forth. And if you'd have accepted their accounts, you probably wouldn't have been able to come up with a non-paranormal explanation. But the point is their accounts were inaccurate. Now, more recently, people like Richard Wiseman, he's carried out a series of faked séances to investigate this kind of stuff. Richard did a nice little study on... we all remember Uri Geller. He's still going, bless him. But when Geller first appeared on the scene back in the 70s, I was a complete believer. I was so excited. I really thought he was the real thing. There were a number of respected scientists who were saying that they thought he really was the real thing. And of course, the one thing, of all the things that Geller did, the one thing that really caught the public's imagination was the metal bending. The fact he said he could bend spoons just by gently stroking them. And now I've got lots of friends who are conjurers.
Yeah, of course.
and they can do this sort of stuff, and they say it's a trick. Sure. It doesn't involve any psychic powers. If Uri Geller's doing it using psychic powers, he's doing it the hard way. Because it looks exactly the same when you do it as a trick. But other people would object and say, but no, it can't be just sleight of hand, because I've seen him do it. And when he put the spoon or the key down, it continued to bend. Now, Richard, who's a member of the inner magic circle, not just the magic circle, that's not enough for Richard, it's the inner magic circle. Richard thought this was probably just the power of suggestion, did a nice, simple little study, showed one group of participants a video of an alleged psychic who was in fact a conjurer, doing a spot of psychokinetic metal bending. And when the key's put down on the table after it's been bent using sleight of hand, in one condition, the participants hear him say, it's still bending. And in the other condition, it's exactly the same, but they don't get that verbal suggestion. Of those who get the verbal suggestion, 40% report they think the key carries on bending. Virtually nobody in the other condition does. Just a very simple manipulation, a very big effect. We followed up on that because we were interested in something called the memory conformity effect, which is when one person's account of what they've witnessed might influence a co-witness's account. And of course, that can be important because if the first witness got things wrong, then that's contaminating the co-witness's memory. We used the same video that Richard had used. We had our participants watch the video in pairs and then discuss it with each other and then report back to us independently what they had seen. What the real participants didn't know was that the other person in the pair was a confederate working with us who had been instructed to say during the discussion either it did carry on bending or it didn't. And what we found was that had an additive effect. So if you were in the design of our experiment, if you were in the condition that got the suggestion from the psychic and the reinforcement from the co-witness, we got up to levels of 60% of people reporting they thought the key carried on bending. So it's not just what happens while you're witnessing an event that's important, it's also what happens afterwards. That can affect your memory.
We are ourselves creating our own ghosts and our own spirits that we're then encountering.
I think there's a lot of truth in that, yeah. I mean, another kind of factor is that kind of people, we don't like to not have explanations for stuff. So any kind of if things are happening in our environment that we can't explain, we might, if we can't think of any better explanation, resort to thinking that it's a ghost, Now, that might not be, sleep paralysis we've talked about already, but kind of movement of objects and so on and so forth. And just because we can't think of an explanation doesn't mean there isn't one. It might be the kind of vibrations from traffic going nearby. There was a lovely example that I always talk about when I'm doing talks on this stuff. It was in the paper a couple of years back now, of a chap who would work in his shed, a little workbench there. He'd tinker about all day, and then he'd go to bed, lock up. And when he came back down, he was very messy. He'd leave all his bits and pieces out. He'd come back in the next day, and it was all tidied away. And this was happening repeatedly. He could not figure it out. And so they set up a video camera, and they recorded the true explanation. It was a little mouse that would kind of suddenly appear and put everything back in the toolbox. It's there on YouTube. People can check this out, And if you'd have put that forward as a possible skeptical explanation, most people would have laughed at you, quite understandably, because it sounds so ridiculously implausible. Just so happens that it's true.
Well, yeah, because we know we have mice in the world, and we know that they will do stuff, and we know that people leave things, but we don't so far have any evidence to show the alternative, that it was a spirit.
I would agree with you on that. There are some who would disagree.
Of course. Following on, as we're going to be in Chillingham, we have our spooky Ouija board that we're going to be working with. But we've also bought some other classic ghost hunting equipment. We have an EMF meter to measure the electromagnetic fields distributed in the castle. We have some dowsing rods, which you've already mentioned, and I think we've also got a pendulum, a crystal pendulum, a couple of classic things, and we've got a voice recorder that we're going to leave in a room and do some voice recording as well to see what's going on. What are your views on the more technically minded ghost hunters of the modern era?
I think there's a lot of these programs that have these paranormal investigation teams going in, and they really want to give the impression that they are doing science, and they're really not. They're really, really not. I mean, so there's all kinds of things that they will do. Like, for example, they'll leave a recording device on. They'll say that they'll talk about the electronic voice phenomenon, EVP, supposedly spirit voices that you might not hear at the time, but when you play the tape back, or I'm saying the tape, that's showing my age. But when you play the recording back, you'll be able to pick up these spirit voices. Now, there are lots of websites where you can go and you can listen to examples of EVP. Now, as opposed to it being spirit voices, the boring old skeptics like me have two alternative explanations. One is that sometimes you've just inadvertently recorded the voice of a living person. I remember doing a daytime TV thing years back, and the paranormal investigator was playing his EVP, and it was someone singing Celine Dion songs, and it was pretty terrifying, but I just don't think it was a ghost, that's all, But the other time, oftentimes, I don't think it's necessarily speech at all, it's just kind of background random interference, because often people get better results using really old crappy equipment rather than the most up-to-date state-of-the-art stuff. And you listen to these very poor quality, very brief recordings, and typically you can't make out what the message is until you read it or someone tells you, and you play it again and you kind of think, yeah, I can kind of hear that now. And I would say that's the result of what psychologists would call top-down processing. Is once you've got the expectation of what you're supposed to hear, provided there's a kind of similar vowel structure there, then your brain fills in the gaps, and you think you can kind of hear it, So that happens. That happens quite a lot. So that would be my comments on EVP. The paranormal investigators. I think this trend has kind of died down a bit now. They get very excited about what I call orbs.
Oh, orbs.
These were kind of, particularly on digital cameras, you'd get what appeared to be these kind of globes of energy. And whereas they said this was kind of spirit energy that hadn't actually kind of coalesced into a full-form apparition yet, the camera manufacturers would say, no, it isn't. It's a speck of dust or a drop of water that's been caught in the flash out of focus. I tend to favour that explanation.
I actually, as a budding young ghost investigator about 20 or 25 years ago, something like that, actually tested this with some friends. We had a camera, we've got an old mattress in a relatively static room, took a photo, no orbs on the photo, hit the mattress, took a photo. You would imagine we just walked into a graveyard.
Exactly.
That suddenly out of the mattress came many ghosts that had failed to manifest.
Yeah, exactly. Well, but this is it. I mean, again, what they typically miss out in terms of their understanding of the scientific method is some sort of control condition. Do you get more orbs in a supposedly haunted location? I mean, one or two people have actually carried out these tests, and no, you don't. You're just as likely to get these orbs, as you say, in a non-haunted location. When it comes to EMF, there's a really interesting idea, which I as a skeptic would love to be true. This was an idea that was pushed by a Canadian neuropsychologist called Michael Persinger, who is no longer with us, sadly. But he argued that people with particularly susceptible temporal lobes in their brains might be affected by weird electromagnetic fields in the environment. There could be a number of reasons why there might be weird electromagnetic fields in the environment, including kind of the underlying geology, man-made electronic devices, all kinds of stuff. But that this could cause susceptible individuals to have hallucinatory experiences. Now, I would love that to be true as a skeptic. It's a non-paranormal explanation there. I'm not convinced particularly by the evidence, either from Persinger himself or from people who record EMF at supposedly haunted locations. And we did review the kind of literature that was there, or other people have, and overall I don't think there's very strong support for that idea. And certainly the notion that you can take a little EMF meter with a kind of little red LED that lights up,
goes ping,
it's not really going to tell you very much at all. I mean, to properly measure you're looking at electromagnetic fields. Like this room now is full of fluctuating electromagnetic fields, so you've got in 3 dimensions spatially and across time, you have to collect a massive amount of data to really do this properly, and that's hardly ever been done.
No, walking around with a small device, we got
it's
about
not
18
really
pounds of Amazon, and doing this probably isn't.
And typically you often find, that it's kind of when something like that does go off, you think, oh, there's a faulty light switch. You can kind of track it down pretty quickly.
Get it too close to my mobile phone.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, so we're going to be having lots of fun in the dark at Chillingham. My final question to you is, what do you think we should be kind of keeping our eyes out for ourselves? What should we be mindful in terms of our own experience there?
Well, as I understand it, I think you said earlier that you were going to be divided into a couple of you that were not really believers and a couple of you that are believers. I would really expect the non-believers to be in for quite an unexciting night. The believers, on the other hand, I've seen this firsthand, taking part in various kind of ghost watches, etc. over the years. That psychologically they can kind of psych each other up, and so somebody thinks they hear something, they think, oh, what was that? What was that? And then the next thing, oh, can you see something moving over in the corner? Oh, what's that? And it just ratchets up. So the believers, the scaredy cats, are likely to have a more exciting evening. I'd say basically go in there, kind of enjoy it. Make sure you've got lots of activities and lots of snacks.
Yes, lots of snacks.
Maybe the odd little kind of bottle of whiskey or something. Help the night along.
Yeah, exactly. Or just take enough caffeine that you start hallucinating. Anyway.
Yeah.
So, bring your own fun to the environment. Well, thank you so much for your time.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you so much for such fascinating answers to these questions. Brilliant subject. And again, plug the book, Science of Weird Shit. It's fantastic. Buy it now.
Thank you.